The streams of smoke that billowed out of a hidden compound in the Pingfeng province of northeast China at the end of the Second World War wasn't particularly unusual. The colossal incinerators within the 6-square-kilometre complex had been spewing out a constant balloon of grey since the unit was established in 1936. This time, though, the incinerators were being used for more than just mutilated and rotten human remains. It was August 1945. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been flattened in unprecedented atomic blasts, and the Red Army was closing in. Orders arrived from a surrendering Tokyo demanding that all incriminating evidence be utterly destroyed. In the compound just outside Harbin, research facilities were gutted. Thousands of documents detailing vivisection, torture, weapons testing, and rape went up in flames. Hundreds of kilos of dried anthrax were destroyed, and evidence of epidemic-creating biological attacks against several Chinese cities were turned to ash. All potential witnesses were killed. The 300 remaining prisoners in the compound were given the choice between suicide by cyanide or by hanging, while the 600 forced labourers left working on the property were summarily executed. There has not been a single documented survivor. The Japanese personnel that still worked within the unit were told to disappear. Potassium cyanide vials were pressed into their hands, and just before they finally fled, Unit 731 blew up its own headquarters. On the warm spring morning of May 3rd, 1946, a dark blue bus, escorted by a convoy of military police jeeps, ambled through the burnt corpse that was Tokyo towards the former Japanese Ministry of War. Just 3 kilometers away from the Imperial Palace, a 2-month-long renovation process had added a vast auditorium to the ministry that had somehow been largely spared from American firebombing. With its windows covered, the bus from Sugamo prison pulled up to the former ministry, and 26 indicted Japanese militiamen, stripped of their military insignia, stumbled out, preparing to face the first day of the Tokyo war crimes trial. Among the indicted was Japan's former Prime Minister, General Hideki Tojo, who would bear the brunt of Japanese wartime responsibility. But missing from both the list of defendants and eventually the entire trial was General Ishii Shiro, the notorious and ruthless director of Unit 731. The destruction wrought on the biowarfare compound after the Japanese surrender was largely in vain. The victorious American occupiers seemed to hardly care for justice. They wanted the data. They were prepared to pay for the data. Millions of dollars floated from Washington into the hands of anonymous former members of the unit in exchange for complete immunity. Most of those responsible for the horrors of the biological and chemical warfare facility would never be brought to justice, and many went on to forge comfortable and often celebrated careers in the medical industry. The extent of Unit 731's atrocities were only declassified decades later, and even Japan's involvement continues to be denied by government officials. These are the horrors of Unit 731, and this is Crown Undone. If you were to take a stroll down a residential Tokyo street in 1932, past the city's newly built concrete apartments and their protruding grey balconies, you'd likely hear one song in particular drifting from the units. "This is for all the people of the Orient," one verse declared. "The invaluable lifeline of Japan is here. 90 million compatriots will protect Manchuria together." The Manchuria March had become one of Japan's most played songs of 1932. The bravery of the soldiers killed in the Russo-Japanese War and then in the conquest of Manchuria nearly 30 years later were lauded in lyrics that sounded through the 1.4 million radio receivers owned across the country. The new puppet regime that had just been propped up in Manchuria appeared to Japanese imperialists as a utopian dream. Japan had been swept by war fever. The region of Manchuria, as large as Britain and France combined, had huge economic and industrial potential and offered a powerful outpost to watch over the nearby and recently colonized Korea. Imperial Japan's Kwantung Army had seized the North Chinese province in 1931 after the false flag Mukden incident earlier that year precipitated the Japanese invasion. A modest Japanese presence in Manchuria had existed since the Treaty of Portsmouth. The settlement that ended the Russo-Japanese War in 1905 had granted Japan permission to lease the southern branch of the China Far East Railway. But unimpressed by the treaty's terms, Japan argued that it should be allowed to exercise total authority within the South Manchuria Railway zone, and eventually stationed Japanese soldiers in the zone under the facade of providing protection to the railway. Further south, the Republic of China's nationalist government was looking to reassert control over the country that was being exploited by its neighbours and weakened by fragmentary warlordism. In 1929, troops under the Manchurian warlord and commander of the Northeastern Army, Zhang Shuliang, had been defeated by the Soviet Union's Red Army in a conflict over control over the Chinese Eastern Railway, and the weakness of the Chinese military only emboldened the Japanese, who were itching to start a fight. At 10 p.m. on September the 18th, 1931, a bomb laid by a Japanese lieutenant near a section of the railway was detonated, killing no one. In fact, a train was able to pass by the site without difficulty less than half an hour later. Still, the Kuomintang army blamed the Chinese nationalists, and therein lay a perfect casus belli for a full-blown invasion. Australia's Evening Penny Post reported at the time that the incident was, quote, the outcome of Chinese nationalism and the persistent efforts of the Chinese governments to undermine the rights granted to the Japanese by the Treaty of Portsmouth. In response to the bomb, Japanese troops attacked a nearby Chinese garrison, and within months, 40,000 Japanese soldiers had poured into the region. The Japanese presence in Manchuria had finally been consolidated, and the new puppet state, dubbed Manchukuo, was born. In a bid to feign legitimacy, Puyi, the last emperor of China, who had been toppled after the fall of the Qing dynasty, was installed as Manchukuo's nominal leader. The establishment of Manchukuo was one of the most significant early manifestations of Japan's newfound, highly militarized and ultra-nationalist policy of expansionism. And to most of the world, the policy seemed relatively legitimate. A journalist for The Sun in Sydney wrote that, quote, though the efficiency of the Japanese coup in Manchuria indicates careful organization, it must not be inferred that Japan is necessarily the aggressor in the present trouble which has developed between her and China. Blaming anti-Japanese persecution in northern China and the Soviet-inspired nationalism taking hold, the Sun journalist implied that the invasion was a reasonable response to the culmination of a persistent and drawn-out campaign of violence against the Japanese in the area. But during the Tokyo war crimes trial more than a decade later, ex-prime ministers would testify that the government in Tokyo had no control over the Kuomintang army's decisions in Manchuria. Their testimonies would paint a picture of a small military clique that was completely beyond civilian control. And despite private doubts that the seizure of Manchuria would isolate Japan internationally, the Japanese Emperor Hirohito himself published an imperial rescript in support of the Kuomintang army, praising the military for acting in, quote, self-defense against the so-called Chinese bandits. As the Kuomintang army established a firm foothold in their invented state of Manchukuo, proposals for the establishment of a Japanese biological and chemical weapons program were just beginning, and as the eventual leader of the program, Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii was in his morbid element. Shiro Ishii was born on the 25th of June 1892 in the Japanese village of Chiyoda, just a 2-hour drive from the center of Tokyo. The Ishii family was one of the wealthiest in the village, and their vast land holdings provided the family with an air of aristocracy. As the fourth son of patriarch Katsuya, Shiro's opportunities would have seemed limitless. He attended Shiba Middle School and then the fourth higher school in Kanazawa, and by 1916 he had enrolled at Kyoto Imperial University in the Faculty of Medicine, graduating in 1920 and marrying the university's president's daughter. In his book on the testimonies from Unit 731, Hull Gold regarded Ishii as a, quote, problem for others. He was pushy, inconsiderate, and selfish. He spent a year as a commissioned military surgeon in the Imperial Army before returning to pursue postgrad medicine at Kyoto, where the brash and outspoken Ishii disturbed his classmates by making a habit of completing his lab work in the middle of the night, and keeping pet bacteria that he left in petri dishes around the classroom. Naturally, Ishii attracted the attention of both his peers and his teachers, and over the next decade, he was at the forefront of campaigns to establish Japan's own biological weapons program. He had already taken a 2-year tour of the West where he was able to conduct extensive research into the effects and possibilities of biological and chemical warfare. Wars of gas and bacteria were also far more affordable compared to conventional warfare. While germ warfare had been brutally exploited by colonial governments to subdue indigenous populations in the Americas and Australia since the 18th century, it was only in response to the German use of biological weapons during World War I that the 1925 Geneva Protocol explicitly banned the use of germs in international armed conflicts. And yet, the prohibition only inspired Ishii, who would soon follow the Japanese army into Manchuria, initiating the first phase of Japan's biological weapons program in a precursor to the infamous Unit 731. While a biological weapons facility was given a fairly legitimate mandate by Imperial Japan, it was well understood that its operation should be kept at an obvious distance from Tokyo. This was where Manchuria offered two major incentives: a safe separation from the government and an abundance of test subjects. Harbin was the first stop for Ishii and his few hundred army men that arrived in 1932, but it quickly became clear that conducting such operations in the buzzing metropole in Pingfang province, inhabited mostly by Chinese and resettled White Russians, would be too visible. Boarding the now firmly Japanese South Manchuria Railway, Ishii and his men went south. While there were about 300 homes and shops in the impoverished neighbourhood, the vast fields in the south were what attracted Ishii and his men. Everyone that lived in the village were forced out in 3 days. Houses were torched and Ishii moved in. A restricted military zone was established over a 500 square metre plot of land, and highly surveilled Chinese labourers were recruited to help with construction. Brick buildings went up and an airport was built. The final design of the complex contained two main sections, one for living quarters, offices, and a dining area, and the other for the organization's very core. It held labs, prisons, munitions factories, and, importantly, a colossal crematorium. This first compound became known as the Zongma Fortress. 24-hour security guards were stationed at the double iron doors of the facility, which was bound by 3-meter-high walls covered in barbed and electric wire. Even trains going by were made to keep their shades drawn as they passed. According to Hull Gold, the life expectancy of the inmates held in the fortress was said to be just 1 month after arrival. Early tests in the compound sought to determine how long a person could last on just water, how much blood could be drawn from prisoners, and how inmates fared after injections of plague bacteria. If a prisoner was lucky, or unlucky, enough to survive an experiment but were too weak for further tests, they were killed instantly. But the facility wouldn't last long. In August 1936, after a heavy downpour had deactivated the compound's searchlights and electric fence, one prisoner planned his escape. While handing the evening's cutlery back to a guard during the autumn lunar festivals, an inmate named Lee grabbed the warden's hands and hit him on the head. Lee took the keys from the guard's waist, unlocked nearby cells, and with dozens of other prisoners, ran through the compound and formed a human ladder against the final wall to the outside. It's said that Lee insisted on forming the base of the ladder, and as the other escapees climbed out, one final shout was heard from Lee before a barrage of bullets crashed against the wall. While most of the escaped prisoners were either gunned down or recaptured, a few men managed to reach a nearby village, and 5 years after the facility had been established, the secret of the Zongma Fortress was out, and so too were Ishii's men. The publicity that came as a result of the escapees' testimony was enough to cause a clandestine relocation to a much larger site in Pingfang, a region much closer to Harbin. Unit 731 was one of several units established as covert branches of the Epidemic Prevention Research Laboratory at the Japanese Army Military Medical School in Tokyo, dedicated to the development of biological warfare within the Imperial Army. A year after his promotion to second-class senior army surgeon in 1935, an undeterred Ishii was given the keys to the official Unit 731, and soon his career ascent would trigger even a personal transformation. A former member of the unit recalled that on first meeting Ishii, the army surgeon was, quote, slovenly dressed. His uniform was covered with food stains and ashes from numerous cigarettes. But once the two met again in Manchuria, Ishii was, quote, dressed immaculately. His uniform was spotless and his sword was tied correctly. Especially after Japan's latest invasion of China in 1937, the number of biological and chemical warfare units were increasing rapidly, and at the operation's peak, about 20,000 personnel were employed across the units, though Unit 731 had by far the largest backing. In Pingfang, as in the case of the Zongma Fortress, hundreds of villages were expelled, and Ishii's men, now including civilians, took over. A sprawling walled city made up of more than 70 buildings would soon rise from the ashes, and construction was most likely finished around 1939. This time, though, no one would lay eyes on the unit. Even aircraft that entered the airspace above the compound would be shot down. The prison cells were built side by side. Each room contained a flushable toilet, wooden flooring, and thick concrete walls. A hole was built near the floor that prisoners would extend their arm through to receive injections or to have their blood drawn. Cells were kept clean and the prisoners relatively well fed to ensure test results were kept as standardized as possible. 3 massive incinerators were built and quickly put to use within the compound. One former employee recalled that, quote, the bodies always burned up fast because all the organs were gone. The bodies were empty. Screams could be heard from every corner of the complex. The hums of low-pressure chambers, the relentless rattle of shackles, the whirl of human-sized centrifuges, and the constant crackles rising from the furnace pervaded the compound. Hundreds of guards sat in complete emotional detachment as Unit 731 charged ahead. Chinese and Korean citizens were the unit's most common victims, but exiled Russians in the region were also regularly captured by military police and brought back for testing. The atrocities that took place inside Unit 731 over its near-decade of operations were horrific, and experiments inside the compound only grew in morbidity. Prisoners were infected with plague, dysentery, cholera, and typhus. Bacteria would be injected into prisoners, and once the first stages of infection could be examined, a former unit member said that the prisoners were, quote, taken from their cell and into the dissection room. He was stripped and placed on the table, screaming, trying to fight back. He was strapped down, still screaming frightfully. One of the doctors stuffed a towel into his mouth, then with one quick slice of the scalpel, he was opened up. Vivisection became second nature to the medical men running the unit. Plague-infected wheat flour was poured onto nearby villages from the air, and village dogs were captured, fed cholera-laced pork, and sent back. The Chinese cities of Ningbo, Changde, and Nanjing were the worst hit, and tens of thousands of people were killed in the subsequent epidemics. The Japanese were manufacturing 300 kilograms of plague, 500 kilograms of anthrax, 800 kilograms of typhoid, and 1,000 kilograms of cholera each month. 45 kilograms of plague-carrying fleas were incubated per production cycle. There were reports of dozens of victims that had lost hands and feet as a result of frostbite testing. Even the babies born to prisoners were subject to the sub-freezing temperatures. These tests directly informed the accepted practices that we still use to deal with frostbite today. According to Hull Gold, some frostbite tests resulted in, quote, the flesh and muscle falling from the bones. Other experiments left the bones so brittle that they were shattered by the blows from the clubs. Either way, the eventual result was the same: gangrene and the rotting away of extremities. While some of the tests were conducted in the freezing Manchurian temperatures outdoors, others took place inside a refrigerated lab that could reach temperatures as low as -70 degrees Celsius. The testimony of a nurse attached to the unit's maternity section revealed that women were forcibly impregnated and injected with syphilis so the transmission to newborns could be studied. But soon, the study of venereal disease by injection was abandoned, and instead the researchers started, quote, forcing the prisoners into sexual acts with each other. A male and female, one infected with syphilis, would be brought together in a cell and forced into sex with each other. It was made clear that anyone resisting would be shot. Other former unit members claimed that Chinese prisoners were shot in the stomach at point-blank range, so surgeons could attempt to remove the bullets before the victim died. Beheaded captives had their organs instantly cut out to check how long they could function afterwards. Their hearts were often still beating. Dozens of prisoners were herded into concrete dugouts and gassed. When one victim miraculously survived, air was injected straight into his veins. Captives were burnt to death, spun to death, and hung upside down until death. The experiments were limitless in their cruelty. While estimates vary, thousands of prisoners were murdered within the walls of Unit 731, and hundreds of thousands of people were killed by the epidemics that Ishii's men created. Once Tokyo realized that the Soviet entrance into Manchuria was imminent, Unit 731's facilities had to be destroyed. At 6 p.m. on the 14th of August 1945, orders from Tokyo arrived insisting that the unit be blown up. Cells were stripped bare, and just 30 unit members were left to kill the remaining prisoners and detonate the compound. A specially authorized train carried the fleeing medical men from Pingfang through the Korean peninsula and finally across to Japan by sea. Ishii instructed his subordinates to take the secret of Unit 731 to their graves. While the Red Army captured 12 of the unit's researchers and tried them in December 1949, they got off reasonably lightly in exchange for information they had gathered over the last decade. Those captured by the US were secretly given immunity for the same exchange of data, which was then used by both countries in their own bioweapons programs. Despite negotiating immunity with the US authorities, Shiro Ishii spent his last years terrified of Soviet indictment. His cold and hostile demeanor and his propensity for cruelty, which had once been vital to his sky-high success, was unwelcome in the reformed professional world of post-war and occupied Japan. The ruthless medical mastermind behind the notorious Unit 731 would contract throat cancer and die in relative obscurity in 1959 at the age of 69. Other higher-ups in the unit would go on to enjoy respected careers in the post-war order. Some went on to receive awards for scientific discovery, others spent years working in prestigious research labs, and more became the executives of top universities. Unlike in the Soviet trials, Unit 731 was actively left out of the Allies' war crimes trials. American historian Gary J. Bass called the failure to prosecute those involved in Japan's biowarfare program as, quote, one of the gravest stains of the Tokyo trial. Those were the horrors of Unit 731, and this was Crown Undone.